These types of events have really been important, I think, to many of us, and certainly to bring together community and have these ongoing conversations. I know these are very dark times, a very difficult so it's important for us to keep connecting with one another at every level, and this is one of them. So it's great to have you all here. We have, of course, the VP debate tonight, and if you so wish, you can stay. We're going to be showing it here afterwards on the big screen, so you're welcome to stay here. We also have an event on October the 3rd, which is with Helena Koban. It's called Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. And as you know, many of these books have been banned in many bookstores. There's been demonstrations and people have buckled and removed some really important stuff that needs to be said, needs to be talked about. We continue to be steadfast. We continue to do what we believe is right and what we believe needs to happen. So please, thank you again for supporting us. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for being an ally. We appreciate you all being here. I'm going to turn it over to Nader now to introduce our speaker and have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's book talk with Nathan Thrall. I want to begin by thanking Busboys and Poets, particularly Andy Shalal, for creating this type of community space. As he correctly pointed out, this is a very dark time, and the tragedy is the prognosis looks even darker, but the fact that we can gather here to have these type of discussions is something very rare and unique. In many other bookstores, an event like this probably would be canceled. So I want to thank Andy Shalal for partnering with us. This series of events is connected to a lecture series that we're running at Georgetown University. Our speakers that we bring to town give a talk on campus, and then they come here and do an evening book event. And I want to make very clear, this relationship is not sponsored by Georgetown University, but rather by 3 academic units at Georgetown University. I was told by the powers that be to clarify that, and so I have done so. As many of you know, Nathan Thrall won the 2024 Pulitzer Prize in General Fiction for his book, which is on sale today, A Day in the Life of Abd Salama, An Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy. He's also the author of The Only Language That Banned Forcing Compromise in Israel-Palestine. His essays and his writings have been published in most of the prestigious publications that you're all aware of, very mainstream venues, New York Times, Guardian, London Review of Books, New York Review of Books. His writings have been translated into 12 languages. He spent a decade working for the International Crisis Group, where he was the director of the Arab-Israeli Project, and he's taught at Bard College. He grew up in California. He currently resides in Jerusalem. A Day in the Life of Abd Salama has been named the best book of the year by The New Yorker, The Economist, Time, The New Republic, The Financial Times, just to name a few. My favorite endorsement of the book is from Arundhati Roy, who writes, quote, "Nathan Thrall's book made me walk a lot. I found myself pacing around between chapters, paragraphs, and sometimes even sentences just in order to be able to absorb the brutality, the pathos, the steely tenderness, and the sheer spectacle of the cunning and complex ways in which a state can hammer down a people and yet earn the applause and adulation of the civilized world for its actions." So please join me in welcoming tonight to Washington, D.C., Nathan Thrall. So Nathan, congratulations, obviously, on winning the Pulitzer Prize. There's a deep sense of poetic justice here in you winning the prize because, early on after the book was published, I was reading interviews and you mentioned that many of your, book talks roughly a year ago around this time were canceled by bookstores. And you said in the interview, no one really at that time, roughly a year ago after October the 7th, wanted to hear anything about context or nuance that had to do with the Israel-Palestine conflict. Since not everyone knows the story, could you tell us a little bit about what happened right after the book got released and why some of your book talks were canceled?
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming. So I had planned, the book was published on October 3rd, and I had planned to be in the US and the UK for about 6 weeks with Abid Salama. And he and I were both in New York. We had done a few events, and after October 7th, it was obvious that many of the venues that were going to host us would no longer do so. These are not right-wing organizations. They were organizations that considered themselves liberal or progressive, that nevertheless said after October 7th, we can't have a conversation about Palestinian life under occupation. And in a couple other instances, there were actually, the police shut down one event in London. This was the week after October 7th. We weren't singled out. It was anything with Palestinian in the title was being shut down by the UK police that week. Even a concert of traditional Palestinian music at a church in London was shut down that same week. It was a really insane atmosphere for those first couple of weeks, but more significantly, it was an awful atmosphere for Abid's family, and he really felt like he had to cut the trip short to be with them, because right after October 7th, his community was totally trapped. So this is about 130,000 people who live in a walled ghetto, and they have a 26-foot tall separation barrier, sometimes called the apartheid wall, surrounding them on 3 sides, and on a 4th side a different kind of wall that runs through a segregated road with Israeli traffic on one side, Palestinian traffic on the other, Route 4370, sometimes called the Apartheid Road. And the Palestinians who live in this walled enclave live a radically different life than the Jews who live just on the other side. And there are 2 exits from this enclave. One is through a checkpoint into the center of Jerusalem, and the other is the exit at the other end to leave into the rest of the West Bank. And it takes about 4 soldiers to trap 130,000 people inside. You shut down the checkpoint with 2 at one end, and you put a concrete barrier in the only road that leads out at the other, and put down a yellow gate, and that's it. You've trapped 130,000 people, and the whole West Bank works like that. There are a bunch of places that have just 1 or 2 exits, and it's very easy for Israel to control for that reason. And on top of that, the main employment sector for Palestinians in the West Bank is Israel and the settlements, and those jobs are coveted. They're much higher paying than other jobs, and they almost all of them disappeared after October 7th. They still have not come back. Israel has been trying to bring in workers from India and the Philippines and elsewhere to try and fill those jobs. And so people were literally trapped inside his community. They were economically constricted. There was a huge spike in violence from the army and from settlers. We have over 600 Palestinians who've been killed in the West Bank since October 7th, including the close relative of Abid's wife, Haifa. And we have a real increase in forced displacement in the West Bank. So in September of last year, the UN raised the alarm about a great increase in forcible displacement in the West Bank, that there were over 1,100 Palestinians who'd been forcibly displaced. And these were very large numbers, and it had been, I believe, over the preceding 18 months. In just the 6 weeks after October 7th, you had an even greater number of Palestinians forcibly displaced in the West Bank. Entire communities have been removed, And on top of all of that, you have the kinds of violence that Israel is using, the lethal means that Israel is using in the West Bank, are the sort that it had really used primarily in Gaza for the last 15 or so years. Strikes with drones, aerial strikes of different kinds, and a large number of the Palestinians who have died in the West Bank in the last year have died from these lethal means that were very rarely used in the West Bank before. So everything changed for Abed's family, and he really felt like he needed to go back and to be with them, and that was another factor in really ending our tour.
Given the conditions that you just described that Abed lives in, are you still able to see him even though you live in close proximity?
So it's very easy for me to go visit Abed, and it's very difficult for him to come see me. And in fact, the mood in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is very depressed for obvious reasons, and the main kind of literary cultural institution in East Jerusalem is the educational bookstore, which has a location on the main street in East Jerusalem, Salahuddin, and also at the American Colony bookstore. And they approached me and asked me if we would do the first event since October 7th around the book. And I said yes, and we wanted to have Abed there, of course, and we tried to get a permit for him in various ways, and they failed. And so what wound up happening is you had a full room that came to hear about his life, filled with Palestinians, foreign diplomats and NGO workers, Israeli leftists, and they were all there to hear about Abed's life, and he couldn't be there. And he was, all of 2 miles away on the other side of a wall as we're sitting there talking about him. And instead, I read out a statement that he asked me to read, the essence of which was, the very fact that I can't be here to be with you and to tell you my stories is what this whole book is about.
Could you walk us through your motivations in writing A Day in the Life of Abed Salama? Because you'd spent over a decade writing for government officials, political analysis, writing for academics at the International Crisis Group. What motivated you to write a human interest story as opposed to the more typical analytical and explicitly political writings that you had been doing for a very long time?
So the decision to write this book, which is a real departure for me, a very different kind of writing, came from a philosophical change about the kind of change that was needed to really make a difference in Israel-Palestine. And at the time that I was deciding to embark on a different approach, I really was filled with despair. I was filled with despair at how the world had grown numb to the Palestinian issue, how it was steadily sinking in global priorities. It was true that you would have a spike in interest and a spike in mobilization when there was a war in Gaza or some major event in the West Bank, but that would immediately disappear, and the world would go on basically tacitly accepting the permanent subjugation of the Palestinians. And so what I really wanted to do was to try and bring our attention to the situation as it exists day in and day out, even when Israel-Palestine is not in the headlines, even when there isn't a war in Gaza. when there would be a war in Gaza, you'd hear world leaders say, we need to restore calm. And what I wanted us to look at is the situation as it exists every day, which is anything but calm for Palestinians, and for us to feel it viscerally, not just to kind of understand it intellectually or analytically and to be bombarded with kind of objective descriptions of checkpoints and segregated roads and the like, but to really have an emotional connection, because I've seen time and time again how people who have very little knowledge of Israel-Palestine come on delegations. Often, advocacy groups will sponsor trips for congressional staffers and others to Israel-Palestine, and it's like a week-long trip with 6 days for Israel and half a day in the West Bank. And the half a day in the West Bank is the most important part of the trip because it is a total gut punch for any person with warm blood in their veins. And you go, and I've seen it. They don't need to be led. They don't need prodding. They are spontaneously making connections to Jim Crow and apartheid in South Africa. And they feel in their bones that this is something that is deeply, deeply wrong, deeply, deeply unjust, and they also know that they are complicit in it, that they are paying for it, that they are helping to perpetuate it. And that gut feeling is what I wanted to produce with this book. I think that gut feeling is 1,000 times more important than actually the knowledge of dates and statistics and so forth, which you can get in the book as well. But I really wanted to get people with that gut feeling. And I have to say also that, I had in my previous work, for a decade, I was working for an NGO, the International Crisis Group, and my job was really to talk to policymakers and diplomats and politicians and other analysts and journalists. And I found time and again that people would privately tell me that they liked what I was writing and that they were persuaded by what I was writing. And I had, very senior U.S. officials tell me, of course, like, I actually agree, the occupation isn't temporary. It is going to last forever. The Israeli expansionist project is succeeding. Palestinians are being constricted into smaller and smaller spaces. There is no end in sight to this, and part of the reason that there is no end in sight is because my government is supporting it. It's protecting it. It's funding it. It's giving arms to it. And yet, I am not going to do anything different, Nathan. I'm not going to say anything different. I'm not going to act different in any way. And the reason why is very simple. It's that the kind of thing that I could even entertain doing is so small you would laugh at it. It would be the most incremental, tiny change, and I could lose my job over it. I could lose my career over it. And at the very least, we're talking about weeks and maybe months of headache. And it's all for something that you would laugh at. So I'm not even going to bother. And I had so many of those conversations with people who I was grateful were that honest with me, that I said, I'm doing the wrong thing. I'm writing for the wrong people. I'm focused on the wrong people. What needs to change is the public conversation. What needs to change is our general understanding that would open up the space for these policymakers to start to actually act on what they privately believe. And so I decided that I was no longer going to try and do that kind of work, and that I was going to try and reach a broader audience. And the way to do that is through narrative, is through an individual story that can pull people in and make them feel something. And I said to my editor when we started on this project, I said, the only way we're going to make a dent is if we write something that makes people cry. And so that was how this came about.
Mission accomplished, because you won the Pulitzer Prize, right? You reached a mass audience, so congratulations on that. A related question is why this particular story? Like, there's a lot of things happening in the context of Israel-Palestine. Why focus on a story that revolves around a school bus accident in Jerusalem when there were probably other choices that you could have made?
Yeah, I think the natural thing that most journalists would go to is some major event that had been in the headlines of international newspapers. And I very much did not want to choose that kind of event. I wanted to choose something that was commonplace as a bus or a car accident. And the reason is that what I was trying to do in this book, among the other things that I just mentioned, I was also trying to give a history of Israel-Palestine through the lives and family histories of the characters, but I was also trying to describe this system of domination of Israeli Jews over Palestinians. And in order to critique a system, I think you really need to show the everyday. If you choose something, a Gaza war, a major invasion of Jenin, it's too easy to dismiss as an exception. This was the decision of one bad commander. This was the decision of this particular prime minister at this geopolitical moment. And the truth is, this system exists no matter who the commander is. It exists no matter who the prime minister is. There's so much conversation in the US media about Bibi this, Bibi that, will Bibi survive? It doesn't matter. Bibi can leave tomorrow and this system will be in place. And so I wanted to focus on something that would show that would show the everyday that is going to exist no matter who is the prime minister, no matter who is the commander in the West Bank. And so it was my aim to find something that would illustrate every day and would also illustrate this very, very complex bureaucratic system that can make people's eyes glaze over when you do describe it in its details. In its details, I mean, in its morality, it's very simple. It's obvious, as I said, 2 hours in the West Bank and people understand the moral truth of it. But in its details, the means of land confiscation rely on laws from different eras, including the Ottoman era, and et cetera. You can write, hundreds of pages about the means of land confiscation. You can write hundreds of pages about checkpoints and about segregated roads and so forth. And so I wanted people also in the book to understand the system, and actually the simplest way to understand a really complex system like this is just to be in the shoes of one person who has to navigate it to find his son, who may be located at a hospital on the other side of a wall that he can't cross, a checkpoint he can't go through because he's got the wrong color ID, and just to learn through the journey of this man to try and locate and find his son what it is he's living in and day out.
Yeah. Look, the success of your book must be both gratifying and deeply painful for Abed, because it's set against the tragedy of his son and the larger plight of the Palestinians. You gave an interview where you said that Abed would have tears in his eyes often when you spoke to him, and then you would apologize, but then he would shut you down and say, no, don't apologize. I like crying over it because I feel closer to my son by talking about him. Could you talk about that aspect of the book and how difficult it must have been to sort of navigate those tensions?
I mean, the book is a very intimate book, and it's intimate because of the trust that Abed and other people bestowed on me, and the credit for that intimacy that exists in the book is entirely theirs. And so I spent a great deal of time with him, and a lot of that time was not an interview so much as just us talking about life and about his grief, and those were tear-filled conversations. And it's true. He would always tell me that he enjoyed those conversations, even when I apologized to him for bringing up painful subjects. And I think that it wasn't just him. There were others as well who part of this process was that they were living in a cloud of silence because the people around them, including very close family members, never wanted to bring up this awful event for fear of upsetting them. But some, and not all, but people like Abed were hungry to talk about it and felt that they couldn't, and I was a way for him to talk about it.
So there must have been, I guess, a sense of sort of satisfaction in the sense that even though there's a tragic story, the death of the son here had some bigger purpose because it led to the book, it led to greater consciousness and awareness about the plight of the Palestinians. You know, Abed's son didn't die in vain.
So for me, the most gratifying part of this whole process has been seeing how Abed has taken pride in this book and his son's name being on the tongue of people all over the world. And he was the first person I talked to when I got news of the Pulitzer, and he was also the one who was the most moved and the most happy of any person I knew, and is still to this day. And he said to me, "You immortalized my son," and so I think that he. I think that he is very happy that this book is reaching people.
Right. Now is a good time to ask you to maybe to read an excerpt from the book that you'd like to share with the audience. You said that you had a passage that you'd like to read.
Sure. So I'll try and I don't know how many people here have read the book. I'll try and do something that's not too long. So I'm which, as it happened, was built on land confiscated from his family. Detainees used buckets as toilets. Abed stayed there for 2 months and was allowed to shower only twice. Next, he went back to Ofer, where he was tried and sentenced by a military court to 6 months, then to Dahriya again, and finally out of the West Bank to Israel's largest prison, Ketziot, in the Negev desert. It was built to confine the thousands of West Bank and Gaza Palestinians rounded up during the Intifada, at a certain point holding 1 in every 50 Palestinian men. Politically aware inmates named it Ansar III, after the Ansar prison camp Israel had erected when it occupied southern Lebanon. but most referred to it by the Arabic name for the area since before Israel colonized it, the Nakab. Abid arrived in the Nakab in the winter, when the temperature of the desert nights would drop below freezing. The facility was made up of more than 100 crowded tents, with a couple dozen detainees in each. Every cluster of 2 to 4 tents was surrounded by a dirt mound and enclosed with barbed wire. It was easier for Israel to control the inmates by giving some autonomy to the factions, allowing each to run its own tent. In Abid's cluster, there was one tent for the DFLP, one for Fatah, and one for the Islamists. When new prisoners were brought in, they would line up before the heads of the factions and declare their party affiliation. Not everyone had one, so this was the moment when they had to decide. Abid saw one prisoner approach the front of the line and declare, "I'm with the PLO." Everyone around him laughed. "We're all PLO," one of the party leaders said, since the PLO was not a faction, but the umbrella group for all the non-Islamist parties. "Okay, I'm with Abu Ammar," the man offered, using the kunya or honorific for Yasser Arafat. He was put with Fatah. 2 months later, Abid saw that this man, who had not known the name of the faction he joined, was now the head of Fatah education in his cluster. That, Abid thought, is how they choose their leaders. At the time, nearly half of the 13,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails were in the Nakab. The inmates included most of the more than 2,000 Palestinians held under administrative detention, that is, held without having been charged or tried, and with the possibility that their sentence might be extended indefinitely. Among them were journalists, attorneys, physicians, professors, students, trade unionists, civil society leaders, advocates of nonviolence, and members of Israeli PLO dialogue groups, which were illegal. Unlike Abid, most were not told the reason for their imprisonment. Each tent set its own daily schedule. Abid's DFLP tent held mandatory courses in party objectives, policies, and ideology, and instruction on how to withstand interrogation by the Shabak. Some inmates read and translated newspaper articles brought in by their lawyers. Televisions and radios were forbidden. Great numbers of books were banned, from Shakespeare, Tolkien, and Tolstoy to Solzhenitsyn and the constitutional law of the State of Israel, and none of the prisoners was allowed a family visit. The tents had no tables or chairs, and they flooded when it rained. Even during dust and sandstorms, the soldiers required the tent flaps to remain open. The barrels used for trash overflowed each day, bringing a terrible stench and an influx of mosquitoes and rats. Many prisoners developed skin diseases. But the real torment came at sunset. Every night the Israelis would turn on the speakers and play a heart-rending ballad by Kulthum. She was Abid's favorite singer, along with Abdul Halim Hafiz. He disliked pop music and listened only to the classics. The Israelis played a different wrenching Kulthum song each night. Her songs were lengthy. The most famous, Enta Omri, You Are My Life, was almost an hour long. The anguished prisoners would lie on their beds, listening, homesick, some of them crying, others working on the one letter they were allowed to send each month. Abid didn't dare try to write to Ghazal. The Israelis read all the mail, and who knew how they would use the information against him or her. Instead, he would stand outside the tent and look up at the moon, wondering if at that moment Ghazal was looking at it too.
Thank you. We view these book talk events as sort of community open forums, so there's an eager audience here. I suspect some of them, perhaps many of them, have read the book. So let's turn the focus onto the audience. If you have a question, a comment, not a speech, we have a microphone here, and we'll get to as many questions as we can, and then we'll shut it down after a reasonable period of time having passed. Go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly. So you used the word apartheid, and I've read a few times this Columbia Law Review article, Nakba, that in fact the Israelis just simply want to push people out rather than confine them still in Israel, but make life impossible or kill them. Just wanted to know your thoughts about Nakba being a separate war crime, and how it relates to apartheid, which is, of course, very different.
So, apartheid comes, it's an Afrikaans word, and there is a Hebrew word that's much more commonly used for what Israel is doing, which is separation. It's called hafrada. And, the despite having these roots, the word actually is now a legal concept, and there's a 1973 convention against apartheid, and it's in the Rome Statute is also it's a crime against humanity with a specific definition, which is a system of domination by one group over another with the intent of maintaining that system. And there have been many respected organizations that have written lengthy reports about whether Israel meets the legal definition of apartheid. This isn't about making an analogy to South Africa, it's about whether it meets the specific legal definition. And those include Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the UN Human Rights Council, as well as leading Palestinian human rights organizations like Al-Haq and many Israeli organizations, including B'Tselem. And those reports come down unequivocally that Israel is practicing apartheid, and of course many very senior Israeli officials have also said that. The former director of the Mossad has said Israel is practicing apartheid. The former Attorney General of Israel, the highest legal authority in Israel, has said Israel is practicing apartheid. So in the kind of legal and international human rights community, this has reached a near consensus, but that's about the specific legal term. And the Columbia Law Review article, which is written by someone I greatly admire and like, and who had previously worked for an organization called Adala, which does a lot of legal advocacy work in Israel-Palestine. It's led by Palestinian citizens of Israel. What he's arguing for is, and I have not read that article in full, I should confess, but as I understand it, what he's arguing for is to say that just as we have this Afrikaans word, apartheid, that applied to that situation, here we have something called the Nakba. It's ongoing. It wasn't just a matter of forced displacement in 1948. There was forced displacement that occurred in the years after the armistice was drawn. There were thousands of Bedouin who were expelled after 1949. There were a couple 100,000 who were forcibly displaced in the '67 war and not permitted to return. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a much smaller scale but persistent forced displacement that's happening all the time in the West Bank. And all of this is derived from a general Israeli idea of, as they put it, maximum land, minimum Arabs. And so I think that's a totally valid and interesting idea to try and use this word and to bring this word into the legal realm. I'm not a lawyer. It's not really my area, but I think that's what he's arguing for, and I like that. I like that idea.
Next question. Right there. If you just stand up and raise your hand, they'll get the microphone to you.
Hi. Thank you so much for the book. Thank you also for the podcast interviews that you've given. At this type of event, I've asked before the question, what is the role of the Israeli left, or what is the position of the Israeli left in this story? And usually the answer I get is that they're asleep at the wheel. I want to ask you...
The answer you get is, say it again?
The answer I get is that they're asleep at the wheel.
Asleep at the wheel.
And what I want to ask is a slight variation. You just mentioned B'Tselem, another human rights group. Israeli civil society is doing very effective and I think very courageous work documenting the occupation and denouncing it, and yet there does not seem to be a channel in Israeli politics for that civil society action to actually lead to change. What insight do you have there? What are they doing wrong, and or what is Israel doing wrong that does not allow them to have an effective political voice?
So I think that those civil society organizations that are documenting the occupation and talking about Israeli violations of international law have an outsized voice relative to their size in the society, and they're highly effective when you think about how tiny their number is and how much we've heard about their work. But the fact is they represent a very, very, very small sliver of Israeli society. They are as marginal as it is possible to be. And so there is not a single Knesset seat that they could get. If it were possible to get one seat in the Knesset, they couldn't even get that. Yeah, the threshold is actually getting a few, but it doesn't matter. And so that, one example I like to give is the protests against the judicial reform. Here was something that I felt was so telling, which is that sociologically, the people who were coming out to protest against the judicial reform were largely middle and upper middle class Jews in the greater Tel Aviv area. And they came out in very, very large numbers. These were huge protests. And they came out when they felt that their interests were threatened, when they felt that Israel was at risk of sliding into theocracy or further into theocracy in a way that would threaten their quality of life as Jews. And they have never come out in those numbers, in anywhere approaching those numbers, to protest on behalf of people who aren't theoretically one day going to lose rights as Israel slides deeper into theocracy, but who, for over half a century, have been deprived of basic civil rights based on their inborn characteristics. And it was so deeply ironic that the headline of these protests was democracy. It was preserving democracy, and all of these people were at night taking Zoom classes about, the importance of the judiciary and how does the judiciary work in different countries, and learning about, constitutions in different places, and yet there was no significant presence for anyone who was talking about millions of people who are deprived of basic civil rights by Israel. And they did exist at those protests, but they were tiny. And so I think that, that it's just the people who are focused on Palestinian rights are a very influential but tiny group.
Questions? Yeah, we have one question way at the back of the room. Yeah, right at the back. Can you get there?
You might have to come up in this area.
Yeah, I
I'm
might
not
have to come
sure
up a bit closer because the microphone cuts out.
Around this way, please. Thank you so much.
There you go. Perfect.
Hi. Hi. Sorry, a little under the weather. Full disclosure, I haven't read the book yet, but after reading that passage, I'm definitely going to.
Could you hold your microphone closer to your mouth?
Full disclosure, I haven't read the book yet, but after hearing that passage, I'm definitely going to. I agree with you that because of the various interests and, I guess, stakes involved in the Israel-Palestine issue, a narrative and like a story that makes people cry is the best way to cut through the noise. But I guess my question is, knowing like the different contexts at play, like, you know, historical, geopolitical, economical, religious, etc. Where do we go from here? And actually, where do we go from here as citizens of a country that is admittedly complicit in this, you know, like atrocity?
So, you know, obviously I think that all of us need, the first step is for us to realize that we are complicit, and the second is to end that complicity. And, you know, before we talk about, you know, doing anything, you know, benevolent or humanitarian, we should just stop doing things that are actually actively facilitating subjugation. And I think this is often framed as though, you know, people are asking the U.S. to go out of its way to like save the Palestinians, when in fact the situation is that the U.S. is actively helping to oppress them. And so this isn't a matter of, you know, walking by a man, you know, beating a small child and, you know, risking your own skin to save the child. It's that you're, you know, handing clubs and chains to the man. And so the first thing is stop handing clubs and chains, and then we can talk about next steps. If you're asking me about where do we go from here in terms of solutions in Israel-Palestine, I think that we are eons away from any kinds of solution, and the reason for that is a simple matter of incentives. And so we hear so many American leaders and secretaries of state who have always told us that this situation is unsustainable. Unsustainable, unsustainable, unsustainable. We hear it over and over again, and the corollary, it's inevitable that Israel is going to have to choose. One day, inevitably, Israel is going to have to either give the Palestinians citizenship and equal rights or sovereignty on 22% of their homeland. And this is obviously false. It's very sustainable. It's lasted for the majority of the State of Israel's existence. It's been well over half a century, and Israel is able to continue to perpetuate it, and it prefers to perpetuate it over either giving citizenship or sovereignty. And until that changes, there's no point in having debates about what the right outcome is for the place. We need to get to a place where Israel actually does feel like it has to choose. It doesn't have to feel like, it doesn't have to choose. It is, we're decades away from that. We are now seeing the very first baby steps toward accountability. But until Israel actually feels that there's a real price to pay, and this is bad for them, and in order to escape being a pariah state, in order to escape you know, losing U.S. military support, in order to escape, you know, the EU-Israel Association Agreement being canceled, in order to escape the fact that there are now Security Council resolutions being passed because the U.S. isn't automatically vetoing them, we have to choose. We have to do something like give Palestinian citizenship or sovereignty. But until we reach that reality where there's real pressure on Israel, there's no point in it's a totally abstract conversation. We could be debating, you know, what kind of fountains we want to see in the town square of our future, you know, utopia.
The related question, I'm just going to interject here, is what advice do you have for this audience in the context of an American presidential election? The choices aren't very good when it comes to this topic, but I would make a case that, you know, there is a choice to make, if not for the president, but also down ballot, because there's, you know, the American presidential election we vote for not just the president, but Congress and other things. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, first of all, I think that the press is so desperate for Trump to lose and Harris to win that they have taken a slight change in tone without any change in substance, with full support for the Biden administration's policy explicitly. She's affirmed it over and over again. They've taken this slight change of tone and let her off the hook completely. And all of this talk of how unacceptable it was to vote for Biden has really diminished greatly now that Harris is the candidate, even though she supports the exact same policies. That's the first thing I'd say. And the second thing is, often when people make arguments, they make them, as though there aren't trade-offs, that the choice that they prefer is better in every way. And I think there are real trade-offs here. I think that it is the case that the situation for Palestinians is very likely to become worse with Trump. I think that he would greenlight things that are not, that the Israeli government doesn't think are possible right now, including much larger scale forced displacement. That said, if it could be, if one could persuasively make the case that the Democrats lost this election over Gaza, and people believed that, that would have tremendous long-term implications. And so that is a trade-off that people have to think about. But that's a big if, because even if the Democrats lose this election over Gaza, there will be a huge effort to try and deny the fact that that's the case. There will immediately be all kinds of people, mainstream commentators, who will be saying, no, the Democrats didn't really lose because of Gaza. So it will be the job of others, and I don't think that I don't see evidence that they're going to be up to the task to persuasively make the case that actually the Democrats did lose because of Gaza. And if they could succeed in doing that, then I think that that could really resonate. Because, if you look at the success of AIPAC, they only have a few scalps that they can point to. Two very recent ones, Cori Bush and Bauman, but they only have historically a few, and it's enough to scare people for generations. So and nobody has a presidential election that they could point to. So if you could point to a presidential election that was lost for the first time because of a candidate's or a party's opposition to Palestinian rights, then I think that would be tremendously beneficial. Mm-hmm. But there are many ifs there.
Yeah, good. 1, 2, 3, and then we'll go down to the back. So we'll get to you. 1, 2, 3, and then over there.
So you touched on politics. We're here in D.C. The dominant political orthodoxy has always been to defend Israel, no matter what they do. We see that at the State Department. I understand what you're saying, if we could point to losing over Gaza, like if we lost Michigan or something like that. But I guess my question is, it almost felt like Biden, you're talking about incentives too, and people always, like here in DC, I used to work in politics, like it's always about elections, but it felt like Biden was actually choosing supporting Israel over winning at a certain point. Like all the polling was showing where young people were on this, people wanted to stop the bombings, yet he wouldn't move. And so I wonder, what is it going to take here in DC? Because I always thought like, it's about elections, and if we could kind of make it so people lose, like there will be a shift. But it felt like, he dropped out because of his debate performance, but like he was losing, and he was, I think, partially over this, and he still didn't change. So what do we do here in DC to kind of it feels insurmountable. I hate to say that, but like shifting this kind of political orthodoxy that people just have on this issue.
So I think there is a lot to be depressed about. I think that there is a real absence of, organized political money on the other side of this issue. It just kind of doesn't exist. And I think in the minds of the people in the Biden administration, I think that they feel like they're actually triangulating very successfully. That like they've taken a path where they haven't alienated too many donors, and they've and the left they feel is going to vote for them anyway because of nobody wants Trump. So I think that they actually feel like they, in pure political terms, have basically succeeded on this issue. But I think that if there were I don't want to overstate it, but I do think that the amount of mobilization that we've seen, the campus protests, the public opinion polls showing majorities who don't believe we should be arming Israel, I think that those things have the power over the long run to start to change things. I think a lot of other things need to be in place, including organized political money. But I do think that those things have the power to start to change things, and I do think that some little things that have happened have come about in part because of this change in public opinion. So, for example, the Biden administration, again, baby steps. I don't want to overstate anything, but they opened a crack by imposing sanctions on Israelis for the first time, by imposing sanctions on violent Israeli settlers. Now, of course, it's a very small number. It's the state itself that's responsible. But this is something that can be amplified, and every few weeks there's a new tranche, and you could get to things that are much more significant. And I think that is a bone that is being thrown to the left in some respect. So I have long-term hope, and I share your short-term despair.
You had your hand up, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm originally from Bangladesh. I'm a Muslim. My three questions.
Just one question, please.
One question? Okay, it's all related. So after October 7, what world, like the whole world is divided, what we get? Then since 9/11, USA, I'm a US citizen, we are fighting against war on terrorism. And Hezbollah and Hamas is a terrorist organization that we understand as an American citizen. So who is going to fight against war on terror if USA doesn't? Because Hamas, Hezbollah, and all the Muslim Brotherhood terrorism, they are threat for our national security and global security. I understand a lot of wrong thing going on in Middle East, but who is going to fight war on terrorism if USA doesn't?
Do you want to take this one now?
No. I mean, I'm not sure what the question is. Maybe you figure it out.
So, first of all, I would say that Hamas is not a threat to U.S. citizens. Hamas is an organization that has Palestinian liberation as their primary goal. They're a Palestinian organization, and they are not interested in attacking Americans. The broader question: who's going to fight the war on terrorism if the U.S. doesn't? That's the question? How well is the war on terrorism going?
mean, and the question itself is loaded, right? Because the term terrorism is it's not an objective term. It's basically who my enemy is, right? So it's a loaded question to begin with. It doesn't help us get anywhere. So I think you've answered it succinctly and accurately. Let's go to the next question. Yeah, right behind you. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Right there. Raise your hand. There you are. Yeah.
Thank
You're
you.
next.
I want to build on the question that was back here and actually your comment. You said that in Israel, it was a very small sliver, a very effective sliver and vocal sliver, but a very small sliver of the population that was for exposing Palestinian rights and fighting for that. So how would you evaluate that here in this country? I mean, most of us here have all been working together and are active in very different ways, so we can look at each other and say, wow, we're really strong, we're big in numbers, but are we a small sliver? And so I guess that leads me into what you were saying about when it comes to the election, are we a big enough sliver to make a difference? Because there was a column just recently by Robert Reich saying, if Harris loses, it's because ... No mention of Gaza. Another opinion person in the Post today is like, well, if she loses, it's because ... No mention of Gaza. So even all of these people, they're already ignoring. Are we a small sliver or are we bigger?
So, I don't think that in the U.S. it's a small sliver because there are public opinion polls that are showing majorities, even majorities of Republicans, who are opposed to arming Israel. So that in the U.S. it's a totally different situation. In Israel you have a tiny group of civil society activists who have a relatively large megaphone, but have their message does not resonate with any significant number of Israelis. But in the U.S. it's a totally different situation. You have a huge proportion of the public, a majority, that is opposed to what this government is doing, and there doesn't appear to be any possibility of having the government actually act in line with public opinion. So that it's not a small sliver at all. It's a matter of much better organizing and all kinds of other things. But here I think that you can have a lot more optimism because you've already won with the majority of public opinion.
Especially younger Americans, right? I mean, you see the polling, younger Americans are much more adamant and outspoken on this issue than the previous generation. So that's a shift, but I think what you're saying is this needs to be channeled and politicized into sort of organized political movement, or else it's not going to rise to the top and make the type of changes that we want to see.
Yeah.
Let's take another question. Yeah, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
If you can come a little closer.
Thank you, Ann Wilcox. I just wanted to raise the issue of congratulate you for getting your book into all these book clubs and the mainstream, because so many journalists who talk about these issues are taken off the air, they're deplatformed, taken off CNN. And I just wanted to mention, this is a pretty informed audience, but I just saw that Ta-Nehisi Coates has written a new book called The Message, which has a whole segment on his experiences in the West Bank. And I think he's a pretty popular guy anyway, but I just hope that people will not only buy your book, but his book to get the word into the mainstream. So just
Thanks,
that comment.
Yeah. He's actually in Washington, D.C. tonight, and we're trying to bring him here at this bookstore if we can get him. Do you know him?
I've met him.
You met him?
I don't know. I wouldn't say I know him.
Okay. I was going to ask you to put in a good word for us to get him here, but if you don't know him that well, we'll have to figure out another way. Yeah, at the very back, and then you're next, okay? The brother with his hand up. Yeah. At the very back. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
If you can
with the
come
laptop.
over
Could you raise your
here.
hand? Yeah.
Hi, if you
You
can
have
come
to come. You have
right
to come
here.
up, or else the microphone's not going to carry that far. Thank you.
Right here should be good.
Hi, thanks for coming today. I want to ask a question. Someone who has been, I think, studying this conflict prior to October 7th. I went to a school that was very Jewish, a college that was very Jewish, worked out well. Have been studying it for a few years prior to October 7th. So I would say that I go to a lot of pro-Israel and pro-Palestine events just because I want to see both sides. I just view it as more complex than either, which I know a lot of people don't like that word because they think it's like ducking, but like I just genuinely believe that there's more to it than what both sides are willing to say. My question to you is that I acknowledge that the situation in the West Bank for Palestinians is really bad, to say the least. However, do you acknowledge that there are legitimate security concerns that Israel does have in regards to the West Bank? The Palestinian Authority openly pays for the slaughter of Jews, like they pay people to slaughter Jewish people within Israel proper. There is Hamas presence within the Palestine. Well, hold on, let me finish what I'm saying.
Yeah, go finish your question. Finish
So
your question quickly.
yeah, my question is like, do you acknowledge that there are legitimate security concerns that for a Palestinian state to happen to be erected within the West Bank? Like, how do you prevent, for example, Iran from using the West Bank as a launching pad to attack Tel Aviv with missiles, for example? Like, how do we go about doing that so Palestinians can actually have a state?
Thanks. So, without getting into some of the specifics that you mentioned, the broader question is, does Israel have security concerns? And the answer is yes. Israel has security concerns. Does that mean that everything that Israel is doing is as it tries to characterize it, driven by security? And there are so many things that are happening in the West Bank that are characterized as driven by security that have nothing to do with security. And I'll just give you an example. From the book. The checkpoint next to the accident site that this bus went through, this school bus went through, just before the accident occurred, it is manned, at the time of the accident, it was manned twice per day. It was manned in the morning and in the afternoon at rush hour. Now, there's nothing more security-oriented than a checkpoint. It's literally there to check people for security threats and let them through or not let them through based on that assessment. So what is the rationale for having a checkpoint that is operating only at rush hour in the morning and the afternoon? Did Israeli intelligence hear a meeting of all the Palestinian militant factions that said, we're only attacking at rush hour? Like, never attack in the evening, never in midday, only at rush hour? No. The real reason is that just beyond this checkpoint, this road merges with a settler road. And that settler road, is used by settlers who are going to and from their jobs, from their homes to their jobs and back. And the success of the settlement project depends on suburbanization, on the feeling that settlers have that they are just living in any other suburb of a major metropolitan area in Israel, and that it's very easy to go to your job and that the commute times are short. So that checkpoint, which is the definitional security issue, is actually there just to reduce settler commute times. I'll give you another example. In downtown Hebron, Israeli settlers have taken over many homes in the downtown area. And this is a very small population of Israeli Jews, 800 Israeli Jewish settlers in Hebron, which is about 200,000 Palestinians. And so to protect 800 Israeli settlers who are actively taking over this downtown area against the will of this 200,000 that doesn't want their downtown taken over and turned into a Jewish settlement, it requires a lot of Israeli security, real security. They really need to protect those settlers. And so what do they do to protect them? Well, one of the things that they do is they shut down all the shops in the main street, Shuhada Street of the downtown where the settlers are, and they turned it into what the Israelis call, in a disgusting term, a sterile road, meaning clean of Palestinians. So only Israeli Jews and tourists can walk on this road, and Palestinians cannot. Now, many Palestinians live on this road, so what does Israel do? It welds shut the front doors of their homes, and they must enter their home, because they're not allowed to walk on this street, so they certainly can't open their front doors. It's a sterile road, and they're not clean. So they have to walk up ladders, up to their roofs to get down into their homes on this road. Now, that sterile road it's driven by security. Israeli Jewish settlers want to be able to walk around in this area where they have their homes, and they will be safer if there are no Palestinians who are allowed to walk on the road. So it's a security measure that's taken. Now, the question is, where do we ask this security question? In downtown Ramallah, there is no sterile road. In downtown Jenin, there is no sterile road. In downtown Nablus, there is no sterile road. Why is there no sterile road in any of these other cities? The reason is there's no Jewish settlers in the middle of downtown Ramallah and downtown Nablus and downtown Jenin. And so instead of looking at the actual presence of these Israeli Jews coming and performing a hostile takeover of this downtown area as the thing that's bringing about a state of insecurity, we are saying, okay, it's a fact that these people have taken over this area, and now we need to secure them. And you can extrapolate from that to 1,000 other situations. So of course, Israel does have security concerns, and of course, the protection of Jewish settlers who are taking over Palestinian land requires all kinds of security measures. But I think it's presenting the question in the wrong way.
Is not a related answer? Is not another answer to the question is that Israelis will never be fundamentally secure at the expense of Palestinian security? I mean, if Palestinians are occupied, dehumanized, there's eventually going to be a reaction and a rebellion. And that's just Israel-Palestine. There's the broader regional dynamic. The region that Israel is living in, watching this mayhem and this destruction, is generating a level of hostility. So there's the question of the interdependence of security. And I think, unfortunately, many Israelis think they can just continue on. We don't care about Palestinians or their security. And then we had October the 7th. Not to justify what happened, but an explosion like this, if you continue to dehumanize a people, is going to be an inevitable reaction. So is that another way of answering the question of how do we deal with Israeli security, by making the argument it can never happen at the expense of someone else's security, in this case the Palestinians?
I would agree with that, yeah. I think that's well put.
Let's take maybe 3 more questions and we'll try and wrap it up. 1, 2, 3. Go ahead.
I want to ask you, just said that we watch...
Yeah.
Okay. We watch some people who protest asking for ceasefire with Gaza. Same people, same organization asking to continue this war with Lebanon. How you can explain this? I don't understand this situation, but it was weird for me because of hostage or because of what?
You talk about Israelis, I think. Some Israelis are calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, but the same Israelis are supporting Israel's intervention, incursion, and bombing of Lebanon. How do you explain that contradiction?
So I don't think there's that much of a contradiction when you understand that the protests of Israelis concerning Gaza are protests for the hostages to be brought home. They are not protests against the bloodshed of Palestinians in Gaza. They are protests, get our hostages home, and that's it. I mean, that's the headline of those protests, and they're not really anti-war protests.
Sir, you had your hand up. Yeah, just we'll get you the microphone. Just raise your hand.
Do you mind passing this over?
So thank you for coming out tonight. This is very, very special, and also plan to read your book. So I was thinking about what you said before in terms of accumulating money, accumulating power to combat, lobbyist groups and things like that. So instead of people, like us convincing family or friends, I guess what I don't understand is there's a whole Arab community, many other state countries, that if they banded together, they could accumulate enough money, enough power, enough votes, that they could, be a good offset to the Israel lobbyists, and it would become a more, level playing field. So, any
So the
thoughts
question
on
is,
that?
what about an Arab lobby in the United States that can organize themselves and provide a counter voice to AIPAC?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly what I was saying earlier, is I think there needs to be organized political money on the other side of this issue, and there isn't. I think that's essential.
Jonathan. Last question.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan, for coming here to Busboys and Poets and to the campus earlier today. I'll give you a choice of questions. One is political and has to do with Israeli domestic politics and demographics. And then one is much more about Abd Salama. And so which one would you prefer?
Before knowing what the question is.
Yeah, they'll both be interesting questions.
You can ask whatever you'd like.
Okay, I guess in the spirit of what you were talking about in terms of your philosophical change of heart about like the importance of these stories, could you tell us Abed's favorite memory of his son, or something that has come up several times when you guys are speaking together, if that's something that you feel that he would be fine with you sharing?
Yeah. I don't know what he would say is a favorite memory. He after the accident, he deleted almost every video that he has that he had of his son because it was too painful. And one of the few that was preserved because it aired on a TV special, which I describe in the book, and it's his son telling a couple of jokes, which I describe at the end of the book. And so that is that's one of the only videos that he actually has that he's able to look at, and that he does look at, and it's his son. It's his son being witty and actually getting a laugh out of Abed. You can hear him laughing in the video.
Yeah, Nathan, as everyone knows, these are incredibly dark times, especially for those of us who believe in a resolution of this issue. But I deeply believe, having read your book and heard you speak today, that you are really illuminating a lot of this darkness. So thank you for your contributions. Keep writing. I think it is going to make a difference. This is a long haul, but you're sort of one of the, I think one of the torchbearers of this struggle. So thank you for being with us tonight. And please join me in thanking Nathan Thrall.
Thank you. And thank you to Nader for putting this all together and for moderating this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. No, it's a team effort. You're going to stay behind and sign some books? Yeah, so Nathan will stay behind and sign some books. They're over there. And we hope to see you again at our next event. Take